It's wonderful to be with you this evening. Thank you all. Let me add my thanks to the others. Thank you for being here. I wasn't anticipating the kind of day that we've had, and so I'm especially impressed that you're here this evening. And thank you for everybody who's tuning in online as well. This evening, in talking about Judah in the shadow of the Assyrian Empire, I want to focus on really three parts. First, we'll do a little work to situate Israel and Judah in the first millennium BCE. Then we'll turn to the impact of Assyria on Judah, with special attention to the Assyrian devastation that happened in Judah in the year 701 BCE. And then I'll conclude with a little bit of conversation about the ongoing influence of empire after the fall of the Assyrian Empire at the end of the 7th century. So first, to situate Israel and Judah in the imperial first millennium, for the entire time period of the composition of the Hebrew Bible, Israel and Judah really existed in the midst of a number of different major empires. First, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, then the Neo-Babylonian Empire, followed by the Persian Empire. And you can see on the map where Israel is situated, right here. And you can see that amidst these major powers, and we can include there Anatolia and Egypt as well, Israel and Judah found themselves really at a crossroads in between these major imperial powers, these major superpowers of the day, which meant that they had a lot of interaction with these imperial powers and did so really as a minor player on the scene. Even though the cultural output of Israel and Judah in the Hebrew Bible has become the most read text in the history of the world, this is not how it started. It started as part of a relatively small polity, a small group in the midst of other major superpowers around it. It's also the case that I'm going to refer to Israel and Judah. This distinction is important. In the area of the southern Levant, there was a larger kingdom of Israel in the northern part of this area, and then a smaller kingdom of Judah in the southern part. And while they shared a lot in terms of cultural heritage, they were also distinct from each other, and this is going to be important as we walk through the material this evening. So, here is a depiction of the extent of the Neo-Assyrian Empire at different points during its existence. You can see in this darker green area, this is the earlier extent of the empire, and then it extended further in the 7th century, moving down into the southern Levant, including the area of Israel or Samaria, the northern kingdom, and then the southern kingdom of Judah with its capital of Jerusalem, and then briefly all the way down into the area of Egypt. And so in terms of its extent, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, especially in the late 8th century into the 7th century, really grew and expanded, and it's in this period that Judah especially has significant interaction with the Assyrians. So just to situate ourselves, this is where we're talking. I want to start tonight in looking at material, not with Judah in the south, but with Israel in the north. Because the experience of Israel, of Samaria, really stands in the background of everything that happens then in the southern kingdom of Judah as well. And so we can look at an example like this one from Sargon II. This is his so-called Great Summary inscription, where he's describing a rebellion that happened in the area of the Aramean states, including the area of Samaria, the northern kingdom. and he refers to this king Yaubidi from Hamat. He calls him a hoopshu man with no claim to the throne. He calls him an evil Hittite. You can see there's a lot of propaganda here, right? He says he was plotting in his heart to become the king of Hamat. He caused Arpad, Samira, Damascus, and Samaria, this is that northern kingdom of Israel, to rebel against me, had unified them and prepared for battle. He says, I mustered the masses of Ashur's troops, and at Karkar, his favorite city, I besieged and captured him together with his warriors. I burned Karkar, I flayed him, I killed the rebels in the midst of those cities. I established harmony. I gathered chariots, cavalry from among the people of Hamat, and I added them to my royal contingent. This is an image here of Sargon. This takes place around the year 720. At the same time, we have the overthrow of Samaria. So Samaria is overthrown alongside of Yaubidi and Hamat. So also in Samaria we have Sargon overthrowing the kingdom, and he turns the kingdom into an Assyrian province. And we have still the remnants of the palace in Samaria. This is the palace that was destroyed. And by comparison, if we're talking about Sargon, this is an image. You can see this lamassu in the gallery, right? This is an image of a lamassu from Dur Sharukin, from the fortress of Sargon. This is the city that Sargon built for himself, his own capital city. And so you can see the sort of comparison, the quality of the craftsmanship. Obviously, we have royal splendor, but it comes at the expense of destruction. And this is what happens in the late 8th century for Samaria. Samaria tried to band together with these other small polities to resist the Assyrian onslaught and was unsuccessful. So, in the time period that follows, we have more imperial military activity. And in the year 705, Sargon II died. In these moments of imperial transition, there was instability oftentimes that developed in the context of the Assyrian Empire. And these were moments where client states often saw an opportunity to rebel. Now, the northern kingdom of Israel seems to have been paying tribute to Assyria already in the late 9th century, then down into the 8th century until its demise. Judah as well was a client state and was paying tribute. But in 705, in this transition of power from Sargon to Sennacherib, the next ruler, it seems that the Judeans saw an opportunity. They saw an opportunity to rebel. And actually, what happened was that Hezekiah, the king of Judah, started to organize a rebellion among these southern polities, much like what happened in the north 20 years earlier. And in response to this rebellion, we have Sennacherib going on military campaign to reestablish his power across the empire. And what you have here on the left is a map of the path of his campaigning. Now, you can see he moves down the coastal region, and this is important because this is an important highway area, and it's really on the way to Egypt as well. And so he's re-securing his empire in the face of this rebellion. So he moves from city to city, and we have accounts of his campaigns that come from him. This is a text a prism that is actually here in the gallery as well. This is the so-called Chicago prism that has these campaigns, including what is called Sennacherib's third campaign. And this third campaign includes his account of his battles in the area of Judah in the year 701. And part of that campaign he describes like this. He says, "Like a bird in a cage, I imprisoned him," that is Hezekiah, the king of Judah, "in Jerusalem, his royal city. I assembled forts against him and made him fear going out of his city. His cities that I plundered from his land I divided and gave to Metinti, king of Ashdod, Padi, the king of Ekron, and Silbel, king of Gaza. I thus reduced his land. I also added on top of his former tribute of yearly gifts from my overlordship and imposed it upon him. As for Hezekiah himself, the fear of my radiant lordship, the fear of my malamu, overwhelmed him. Urbi and his good troops, whom he had summoned in order to fortify Jerusalem, his royal city, deserted him." Again, with typical royal bombast, we hear the report of the king about his great accomplishments in this campaign account. Importantly here, this figure that he refers to, Padi, the king of Ekron, we know from elsewhere in this from this text that Padi was unwilling to participate in this southern alliance that was rebelling against the Assyrian Empire. And so what happened was Hezekiah, as the sort of leader of this rebellion, actually imprisoned Padi. He went and took him and imprisoned him. And when the Assyrians came, then he was released and he was rewarded for his loyalty. What happened to Hezekiah was the opposite, right? Instead, he had to pay significant tribute beyond what he had been paying before. His wager to rebel turned out to be a bad risk. We don't have total destruction of Jerusalem, though. Notice here we don't have Sennacherib saying that he actually destroyed Jerusalem. Right? So in this case, it's something different than what we see in Samaria. And indeed, Judah is never turned into a province. The reason for that is probably because it wasn't necessary. Assyria had a policy of turning areas into provinces when they were significant risks, right? When they pose significant challenges and ongoing challenges to the sovereignty of the empire. In the case of Judah, it probably never rose to this level, right? So it's not that Judah somehow was able to resist and wasn't then turned into a province. It probably was the case that it never really rose to the level of challenge that would cause the Assyrian Empire to come in and turn it into a province. Now, in the midst of this account, we get many more details about what Sennacherib did in Lachish. And indeed, back in Assyria, in the palace, we had a number of reliefs that were put all around the walls of an entire room in the palace depicting the siege of Assyria on the city of Lachish. And you can't see these particularly well because they're not colored here, but this is a number of the panels. There's a whole room in the British Museum. If you go to the British Museum, you can see all of these panels lining the walls of this room like it would have been in this palace. Originally, these images would have been colored, and so this would have been very vivid. And what it depicts is various parts of the siege of Lachish, the surrender of the people. Here you can't see it particularly well, but these are a couple of Judeans who have been flayed. They're spread out We have other cases where we see individuals who are strung up on poles. It's very vivid, it's very violent, and this is depicting the great victory of Sennacherib. Here's a drawing of part of these images, and here what you see is the siege ramp being depicted at Lachish, and you see the soldiers coming up the ramp, right, up to the city walls, and these are flaming torches. You can see the siege instruments that are being used. Here are some of these Judeans who have suffered and are now strung up on poles. And so vivid depictions of this great military victory that Sennacherib had. And presumably then, when visitors would come to the palace and be ushered in, they would see this, and this is part of the propaganda of the empire, right? This is part of the way that the king shows his power. So again, this happens in Lachish. Lachish is in an area that we call the Shephelah. It's the lowlands. This was the area of Judah that was particularly prosperous economically. This is the area also that is close to that coastal road, and thus politically important for Sennacherib. Notice where Jerusalem is. Jerusalem is off the beaten path. Jerusalem is also in the highlands, and thus less economically prosperous than these lower land areas which were richer agriculturally. But once we have this attack at Lachish, there's also then a turn to Jerusalem. And Sennacherib says, I imprisoned Hezekiah in his royal city like a bird in a cage. Let's turn to biblical texts, because we're going to see the same event being depicted in the biblical texts, also reflected in various other ways in these texts, and see the way in which this event of 701 is told and retold from, in this case, a Judean perspective. So sometimes we have simple references to this event with not much more reflection than a reference to the event itself. And so an example of this we can see in Isaiah 22. You took note of the many breaches in the city of David, and you collected the water of the lower pool, and you counted the houses of Jerusalem and pulled down houses to fortify the wall. This is referring to what Hezekiah did in preparation for the coming of Sennacherib in 701. Here is a picture of this 8th century wall that's been uncovered in Jerusalem. If you go to the Old City, if you go to the Jewish Quarter, maybe you've been there, and you can see this section of the wall that's been uncovered there. This is the wall that's being referred to here, and it was fortified in anticipation of Sennacherib's arrival. And we have simple reference to it in a text like Isaiah 22. You might say, not too much there. We do get, however, in 2 Kings 18 and 19, in Isaiah 36 through 39, also in Chronicles, retellings of the event, much like we have in Sennacherib's third campaign. But instead of them being, of course, from the Assyrian perspective, it's told from the Judean perspective. In the case of 2 Kings 18 and 19, we actually have 3 different accounts that have been combined. So the story here is really not told once, it's told 3 times, but with different details. And I want us to take a look at the way that the Judeans are representing this event from their own perspective. The first of these accounts is very brief, just 4 verses long. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, King Sennacherib of Assyria marched against all the fortified towns of Judah and seized them. King Hezekiah sent this message to the king of Assyria at Lachish. So the claim here is that the Assyrian king is not at Jerusalem. The Assyrian king is over at Lachish. But of course, they know in Jerusalem what's taking place at Lachish. And Hezekiah says, I have done wrong. Chatati, I have sinned, he says. Withdraw from me, and I shall bear whatever you impose on me. So the king of Assyria imposed upon Hezekiah of Judah a payment of 300 talents of silver, 30 talents of gold. Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was on hand in the house of Yahweh and in the treasuries of the palace. At that time, Hezekiah cut down the doors and doorposts of the temple of Yahweh, which Hezekiah had overlaid, and gave them to the king of Assyria. In other words, here we have total capitulation on the part of Hezekiah, and this is told from the perspective of the Judeans. In this case, we have close correspondence. The details aren't perfectly aligned. We have some differences in the numbers, for example, from what we see in Sennacherib's third campaign. But we have a lot of correspondence here between this Judean account and what we saw in the Assyrian account. We get some differences in the other accounts that are preserved. Here's part of one of those other accounts. At the end of it, it says, Thus says Yahweh concerning the king of Assyria, He shall not enter this city, and he shall not shoot an arrow there. He shall not advance against it with a shield, and he shall not cast a siege ramp against it. I will defend this city and save it for my own sake and for the sake of David my servant. So this is a divine proclamation, followed by this narrated material. That night, an angel of Yahweh went out and struck 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. Those who arose early in the morning saw that they were all dead corpses. Now, you might say, this is a significant discrepancy, right? Is it the case that Hezekiah sued for peace and gave away the entire treasury of the kingdom? Or is it the case that there is divine protection that prevents the king of Assyria from having any impact whatsoever in Jerusalem, followed by a divine intervention in which 185,000 soldiers were killed in a single night? This is a major difference, right? Now, how could you come up with, you might ask, an account like this one? The answer seems to be that there is a creative theological interpretation that's going on of the events of 701. All of these accounts, the various accounts in Kings, the accounts in Isaiah, the accounts in Chronicles, Sennacherib's third campaign, they all agree that Jerusalem was not destroyed. Now, how are you going to spin it? You get to decide, right? The way that the Assyrians describe it is that the awesome splendor of the lordship of the Assyrian emperor was so great that Hezekiah was overwhelmed. He was penned up, right, like a bird in a cage. And he paid extra tribute, and the Assyrians went home. In the biblical account, the fact that Jerusalem is not destroyed, as seen in some of these accounts at least, in some of the biblical accounts, as a great victory. And then it seems to be elaborated in various ways, right? The story grows. And this story grows significantly Now, you might say, if 185,000 people were killed in one night outside of Jerusalem, we might actually have some archaeological remains, right, that would corroborate this story if indeed this happened. And the answer is we don't have such corroboration. Instead, this seems to be a hyperbolic kind of theological reflection on the fact that Jerusalem was not destroyed. That by itself tells you something about the power differential between Assyria and Judah. The fact that the Judean capital survived at all is judged a great victory. And then it's elaborated. We have other effects of this 701 experience. And I should say, in the midst of Jerusalem's survival, we have significant destruction, not just at Lachish, but at other sites from this time period in Judah. In many respects, we can say that the only significant site that really survives is Jerusalem, and that's probably because it's not really that significant after all, right? It is the royal city, but in terms of what is significant for the Assyrians, it's not the top of the list. But there are other effects that we can see in Hebrew Bible texts that come from this event. Another one of them shows up in Deuteronomy 12. If you know anything about Deuteronomy, you probably know that this book is really a revision of much of what we have in Exodus and Numbers, both in terms of the narratives that it includes as well as the laws. The laws in Deuteronomy 12 through 26 are a significant revision of what shows up in Exodus 20 through 23. And so if you're reading through a Bible and you read Exodus and then you come to Deuteronomy and you say, wow, this looks familiar, it's because it is familiar, right? Because so much of it is a revision of what you've already read. And this is the case in Deuteronomy 12. This is what is often cited as the lead law of this collection. And it's a centralization law. It's a law about centralizing worship. And it's a revision of what we have in Exodus 20:24. So it's not just borrowing from this Exodus 20 text, but it's also reorienting it, revising it. Look at Exodus 20:24. This is the deity speaking. He says, "You shall make for me an earthen altar, and you shall sacrifice upon it your burnt offerings and your well-being offerings, your sheep and your cattle. In every place where you call upon my name, I will come to you and bless you. B'chol hamakom asher tazkir et shmi avo elecha uverakticha." Look at what happens to this text in Deuteronomy 12. "Be careful lest you offer up your burnt offerings in any place that you see fit. B'chol makom asher tir'eh. Rather, in the place that Yahweh will choose in one of your tribes, there you shall offer up your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you." If you look back at Exodus 20 and you ask yourself, how many altars can there be and where can I build them? The answer, according to this text, is you can have a proliferation of altars. You can build them in lots of different places, right? In every place where you call upon my name, this is a way of referring to sacrifice, I will come to you and bless you, the deity says. Look at what happened in Deuteronomy 12. Not so, right? You can't build altars anywhere. Be careful lest you do that you build an altar anywhere and offer up offerings in any place you see fit. Only in one place, a place that the deity himself will choose. That's the place where you can offer sacrifice. And if you go through the laws in Deuteronomy, you see law after law that has been revised from Exodus 20 to 23 in light of this centralization law. So Deuteronomy systematically works through the material in light of centralization of worship, and it insists on this one place. Now you might say, why does it do that? Now, many scholars have addressed this question, and they've offered a variety of perspectives. Some say that there's a political advantage. If you bring everybody to one worship site, that yields a kind of social cohesion, and that's politically advantageous. Others have pointed to the economic implications of this sort of centralization. If everybody is coming and staying in the hotels, everybody's eating in the restaurants, right? This is good for the capital city. But I think that there's more than that going on here. If you look at Exodus 20:24 and think about it in relation to those events of 701, when Sennacherib and the Assyrian army came to Judah and laid waste, destroyed virtually every significant location save for Jerusalem, where the temple of Yahweh is, you might interpret that event theologically. You might think, you know what? It turns out that it wasn't the case that the deity wanted you to make your sacrifices in any place that you build an altar. Instead, maybe it's the case that what the deity wanted all along was that you worship only in this one place. And so then the text is rewritten, the law is given anew, so that it was always the deity's preference from the start to have Jerusalem as the selected place with the temple. And thus we have this kind of updating of a religious idea that's based on the experience of imperial power that happened in Judah. We have other cases in Deuteronomy that similarly suggest a response to Assyrian imperial incursion. I mentioned earlier that Judah never became an Assyrian province. But we have a law in Deuteronomy 17 about establishing kingship in Israel. And the claim is that if the Israelites would like to establish a king, they may do so, but there are certain stipulations. One of those stipulations is here in verse 15. The claim is that you have to set as king over yourself one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner over you, one who is not your kinsman. Now, if you know your Hebrew Bible well, you might be thinking through texts and trying to remember an example where you have a foreign king as a possible ruler in Israel or Judah. And if you're having a hard time finding an example, you're in good company. I am too. This is not something that is on the agenda in any of these texts that we know of. But several scholars have suggested that this reference to not setting a foreigner over you might actually refer to a potential debate that existed in ancient Judah. A debate over whether or not Judah should capitulate and advocate for becoming a provincial territory of the Assyrian Empire, or whether it should try to hold out, maintain its status as a client state, or even rebel like we know it did. Here, it seems that we might have one side of that debate reflected. The side that says, no, we don't want to be a province. And why would that be? Because if Judah became a province, then they would have direct rulership from a foreign king. They would no longer have their own local king, but instead they would be ruled by a provincial governor and by extension the Assyrian emperor himself. And that seems to be reflected in this text. Now, of course, you would say, but isn't Deuteronomy situated in a much earlier time period? And it is the fact that what it narrates is a much earlier time period, but it seems to be written much later, and it's retrojected into the past. And so what we have here seem to be 7th century concerns that are retrojected into the past, and we have a reimagination of the early time period of Israel that takes into account the political circumstances of the 7th century. We also have examples in the Hebrew Bible of what appear to be direct literary contacts with Assyrian texts. So instead of there being sort of indirect influence like we've been talking about, we actually have instances where it looks like Judean scribes knew Mesopotamian texts and reused portions of those texts in writing the text of the Hebrew Bible. And so I want to point out a couple of these as well. One of these, a very famous example, and this is one that Tim Harrison was referring to earlier, is found in Deuteronomy 28. Deuteronomy 28 contains a series of blessings and curses that are voiced by the deity, and they are meant to be inducements to obedience. But the claim is that if the people are obedient and follow the deity's rules, then he will bless them. But if they are disobedient, then all of these curses will fall upon them. And as you might expect, the list of blessings is short and the list of curses is long. And among those curses are what you see here in these verses. The curses are pretty vivid and pretty awful. Your carcasses shall become food for all the birds of the sky and all the beasts of the earth, with none to frighten them off. Yahweh will strike you with the Egyptian inflammation, with hemorrhoids, boil scars, itch, from which you will never recover. To me, that's like the worst one. Yahweh will strike you with madness, blindness, and dismay. You shall grope at noon as a man gropes in the dark. You will not prosper in your ventures. You will be constantly abused and robbed, with none to give help. If you pay the bride price for a wife, another man shall enjoy her. If you build a house, you will not live in it. If you plant a vineyard, you won't harvest it. Your ox shall be slaughtered before your eyes, but you shall not eat of it. Your ass shall be seized in front of you. It shall not be returned. Your flock shall be delivered to your enemies. It's just a litany that goes on and on and on. Well, when we look at this material, it turns out that it corresponds very closely with a cluster of curses in what's oftentimes referred to as the Esarhaddon Succession Treaty. It's a text that, as Tim Harrison referred to, exists in multiple copies, and it was distributed in the year 672 BCE. It's dated, which is wonderful in comparison to these biblical texts, which have no dates. And it was distributed by Esarhaddon as he was approaching the end of his life. He wanted to secure the rulership of his son Ashurbanipal. And this example, this picture, is a picture of the tablet that was discovered in 2009 at Tel Tainat. This is important for thinking about the connections that I'm going to talk about here in a moment with Deuteronomy 28, because this is an exemplar of this text that exists now from the western part of the empire. Prior to the discovery of this text, now 15 years ago, the only exemplars that were known were from the eastern part of the empire. And this raised some question about the claims that are made in some letters and elsewhere about the distribution of this text throughout the empire. Some scholars said, well, maybe that's hyperbole. Maybe there really weren't copies of this text that made it to the western part of the empire, to the Levant. And if that was the case, then the question of a possible connection between a Judean text, like Deuteronomy 28, and this Esarhaddon Succession Treaty might be called into question. But what we see is this cluster in lines 419 to 430 in this text, in these paragraphs 39 through 42, and these verses in Deuteronomy 28. And you can see that the order is not identical. but it's close. And what scholars noticed already in the 1960s was that there's no native rationale for the cluster and its ordering in the case of Deuteronomy 28. There's no good native explanation for why we have this grouping of curses and in this combination, in this order. But what we have in the Esarhaddon text is that these curses, unlike in the biblical material, these curses are not all attributed to the same deity. In the case of Deuteronomy 28, Yahweh is the agent who imposes each of these curses, or the threat is that Yahweh will impose each of these curses upon the Judeans who are disobedient. In the case of the Esarhaddon text, each of these curses is assigned to a different deity. And what we have in ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Assyria is a set of conventional orderings of these deities in god lists. And what we see is that in these curses, the curses follow the order that we expect for these god lists. With an exception. In the case of the Esarhaddon text, we get a different sequence of the gods Sin and Shamash, who are normally paired, than what we see in other exemplars of these god lists from the Assyrian period. And so when we compare the Esarhaddon succession treaty text to other Ade texts, to other texts that are similar, the pairing of Sin and Shamash is peculiar, the sequence in the Esarhaddon text, and that sequence is also reflected in Deuteronomy 28, verses 27 through 29. And for this reason, we have this density, this cluster of similarities, and we have this peculiar sequence. Scholars have suggested that what we have in Deuteronomy 28 might be a direct borrowing from this Esarhaddon text. Now, it's not from the Tayanat exemplar, unfortunately. Instead, the epigrapher, the scholar who published this text, Jake Lowinger from Johns Hopkins, he has argued that there were probably about 120 copies of this text that were distributed throughout the empire in preparation for the transfer of power from Esarhaddon to his son Ashurbanipal. And it was really about securing loyalty, right, at this moment of vulnerability, at the transition of power, for Ashurbanipal, the crown prince. Right? So, was there a copy of this text in Jerusalem? We don't know. Maybe. It's possible. We don't know enough about the distribution of these texts to be sure. Some scholars have suggested these only went out to provincial capitals, maybe not to all of the client states. And if that's the case, then what we would have to say is that Judean scribes would have had to access it, say, in Samaria, another province. But this is a few scant miles from Jerusalem. And so while we can't describe exactly how there was access, the peculiarity of the similarities in this case, and especially that Sin Shamash sequence, suggests to us that here we have a case of direct literary reuse in the case of Deuteronomy 28 in relation to the Esarhaddon text. We have other instances. This one is even potentially more troubling than the last one. Very famously, you may know this text, the Shema, in Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 5. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. You shall love Yahweh, your God, with all your will, with all yourself, and with all your strength. This text is remarkably similar to another section of the same Esarhaddon succession treaty. Here we have the command, you shall love Ashurbanipal, the great crown prince designate, son of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, your lord, like yourselves. If it's the case that we have reuse in Deuteronomy 28, it raises the possibility that we have reuse of this Assyrian text elsewhere in the Deuteronomic composition, including potentially, in this case, where this command to love, you might say, is a bit of an odd command. What does it mean to command someone to love? In this case, we're talking about a political loyalty. That's what's being described here. And what you see, I would suggest, is a kind of reconceptualization of the Israelite God, the Judean God Yahweh, in an imperial guise, right? So instead of loving the emperor, the command is not to love the emperor. Here in Deuteronomy 6, the command is to love the imperial God, to love the deity. Another case of imperial influence, I would suggest, in these Judean texts. Now, it's not just in Deuteronomic texts that we see this kind of influence. It's also elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. And I want to show you an example here of what we have in the case of Genesis 6:14. This is part of the priestly flood account. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. You shall make the ark with reeds, and you shall smear it inside and out with pitch. V'chafarta ota mibayet umichutz bakofer. So this word, v'chafarta, you shall smear it, this is not a Hebrew word. Now you might say, look, I know some Hebrew. That root, kaf pe resh, that's a root that shows up in Hebrew all over the place. That's true. However, it normally appears in what we call the PL or the D stem, and it means to wipe off. Its semantics are one of removal. And so this is the word that appears, for example, in the name Yom Kippur, right? The Day of Atonement, the day of wiping off, the day of cleaning is what this really means. Here we have the semantics of wiping on, right? It's different. What's more, this is in what we call the kal stem or the G stem, and this is the only appearance of this verb in the entire Hebrew Bible in the kal stem. Now you might say, well, maybe that's the only usage. We don't know everything there was from ancient Hebrew. It's also paired here with this word kofer. Kofer is not a Hebrew word. Kofer is a borrowing from Akkadian, the word kupru, meaning bitumen or pitch. And indeed, in Akkadian, we have precisely this locution, to wipe on pitch, kaparu kupra. This is a usage that we see precisely for scenarios like what's described here. It's also the case, and I didn't add this to the slide, but the reference here to making the ark with reeds, this too seems to be a borrowing. It appears here that what we have in Genesis 6:14 is a reuse from a Mesopotamian flood account. And I can't pinpoint exactly which one it is. But here we have a case of language contact where the peculiarities and the typicalities of the Akkadian language have been carried over into Hebrew and preserved. This is like a miracle that it's preserved in this way, but preserved in this text. So it's not just in Deuteronomy. It's not just in Isaiah. It's also elsewhere that we see what I'm calling here the influences of empire, and we see it specifically at a linguistic level in these compositions. Now, before we close, what about after the Assyrian Empire? We started by saying that Israel and Judah, for its entire existence, was living in the shadow of empire. First the Neo-Assyrian Empire, then the Neo-Babylonian Empire, then the Persian Empire. The same sorts of things that we've been talking about with the Neo-Assyrian Empire show up over and over again with different details in these later periods as well. And so I want to just show you a couple of examples here before we close. The first one is from Isaiah 47. This is from a section of the book of Isaiah that we call Second Isaiah. It's not because it's labeled that way within a Bible. It's not like 2 Kings or 2 Chronicles. Instead, it's a second part of the book of Isaiah that clearly has a separate author. It comes from a different time period. If the first part of Isaiah comes from the late 8th century, what we have here in 2nd Isaiah, this comes from the middle of the 6th century. So it's about 160, 170 years later. And in Isaiah 47, here we're engaging not with Assyria, but Babylon, with Babylonia. This fits, again, the imperial context. This is the Neo-Babylonian period. We find this: "Get down and settle in the dust, young woman made in Babylon. Sit on the ground, deprived of your throne, Chaldean maiden, for you will no longer be called tender or delicate. Take the mill and grind flour, strip off your veil, bear your shovel, reveal your thigh, cross the rivers." What's being imagined here is the demotion of the royal Babylonian figure, who's understood here as a royal figure, a queen, and she's being reduced to like a scullery maid, something like that. In the midst of that, we have this word shovel, which is what we call a hapax legomenon. It occurs one time in the entire Hebrew Bible. Those words are hard to define. We don't always know what they mean. This is another case, I want to suggest, of language contact. This is a case of borrowing, and I think that this is probably a case of incidental borrowing, where the author here probably was living in a Babylonian context and was searching for a word to refer to the lower part of a female body. And it turned out that he didn't have one in Hebrew. And so we have a Hebrew word for the lower part of a male body, the motnaim, but what about the lower part of a female body? And it looks like he's grasping for something, and he grasps for an Akkadian equivalent because this is the environment in which he exists, and he converts it into Hebrew. He brings it into Hebrew. And so he takes a word like shaplu and turns it into shovel here in this text. And so then supplies what he's missing under the influence of his Akkadian context. And one of the peculiarities of this example that's interesting is that the beginning SH sound, the sh, the shin, this is something that in the Neo-Babylonian period was pronounced in Akkadian as a sh, as a shin sound. In the Neo-Assyrian period, this was actually realized as a s, right, as a simple s sound. And when we see borrowings into Hebrew during the Neo-Assyrian period, we see borrowings that render what a Judean speaker hears. And so they will render that Neo-Assyrian shin as a samech, as an S. Not so in the Neo-Babylonian period. What they hear is a sh sound, a shin, and they render it as a shin, shovel, not sovel. An example from the Persian period. In Malachi chapter 1, we have the deity saying, "I am a great king, says Yahweh of hosts, and my name is feared among the nations." This, too, is the appropriation of an imperial perspective on behalf, in this case, on the deity's behalf. This notion of being a great king, a melech gadol, this is the way that Persian kings, say someone like Cyrus, described themselves. right? They describe themselves as great kings, and this language is taken over and brought into the Hebrew Bible and assimilated into the theology of these authors. So, what we see across these time periods is a real extension of what we saw in the case of the Assyrian material, and what it means to understand these Hebrew Bible texts is really to take account of this political and social environment in which they were produced, and that is the environment of empire. Thank you.